The thing I'm going to talk about today is a puzzle called the puzzle of imaginative resistance. And this is a very live, very ongoing philosophical puzzle in the current academic literature. So this is far from, not that we have settled questions in philosophy, but this is far from a settled question. Philosophy normally begins with, or often begins with, common sense, the everyday, received wisdom, and problematizes it, shows how it leads to contradictions or theoretical problems. And this puzzle is, in that respect, no different. So I'm going to start with a claim. I'm going to take this claim to be initially very plausible, and then I'm going to talk about how it runs into interesting counterexamples. And then, at the tail end of the talk, I will go through 3 attempts to solve the puzzle this raises. That is, to explain why this claim that seems so plausible runs into these problems. Okay. So the claim I'm going to start with is a claim I would call poetic license. Okay. Poetic license, the basic idea is that if you are an author of a work of fiction, specifically a literary work of fiction, whatever you say goes in your story. That is to say, an author has carte blanche to make things true in the story of their particular work. That's the idea. Why should we think that? Well, you might think that in the very concept of an author, the etymology of the term comes from the Latin auctor, which means something like progenitor, or creator, or father, right? And you might think that with that concept comes a certain kind of authority. There's that word, author, in authority, right? To set the terms of your story. Another reason to think this is that if we think about actual works of fiction, authors make all sorts of crazy things true in their stories all the time. So to take a high-fashion example, okay, in Goethe's Faust, the play, if I recall, begins when the devil makes a bet with God, transforms into a poodle, and then travels to Earth to seduce Faust. Right? Now, if there were any kind of insane thing to be true in a story, that might be among them. But you might even think of crazier cases, right? We can have people with superpowers, we can have talking frogs, people who can cast magic spells, and so on and so forth. Right? That is to say, the claim, what I've called poetic license, seems to have good reasons behind it. Okay. Just by way of preliminaries, I'm going to set up a couple of terms of art, right? A couple of technical terms that I'll be using. I'm only introducing these not because they're terribly important, but because I'm an academic, I will have a habit of slipping back into annoying jargon. And I just want to make sure that when I do that, you can go, he means this other very simple idea. Okay, so the first notion, first technical term I want to introduce is the notion of fictionality. It's not very complicated. This is just the idea of something's being true, in the case we care about here, true in a story. Okay? So the idea is, suppose I write a novel and the following line appears: there was a beautiful village in England. I'm talking about Alrewas. Okay? Then it's true in the story I've written that there was a beautiful village in Alrewas, ordinarily. Okay? And another way of putting that is to say it is fictional that there was or is a beautiful village in the UK, in Britain. So that's fictionality. The other thing is I will sometimes talk about propositions. And this is kind of important because we want to distinguish sentences from the contents of sentences. Okay? I'm not interested in the claim that an author can put any sentence into their work of fiction. That seems obviously true, and in a way that I don't think runs into counterexamples. At least for any finite sentence, right? That's just a matter of writing some words. What I'm interested in is whether the author, in writing sentences, can make a certain claim true in the story, or as I will call it, a proposition. So the English sentence, there was a beautiful village in England, expresses a meaning, it has a content, okay? And it can be true or false, and it can be true or false in a story. But I can notice that it's distinct from the sentence, right? Because I can express that same proposition in another language. In German, for instance, I could say, es war einmal ein schönes Dorf in England. Or in Spanish I could say, había una vez un pueblo bonito en Inglaterra, right? These are different sentences, but they all express the same ideas, that's the idea. They all express the same proposition. And what we care about here is whether or not authors can make a certain proposition fictional in their work. Okay. But the basic idea is, can an author make such and such true in their story? That's the simple version. Okay. So with this jargon, we have our carefully formulated claim. Okay? An author can make any proposition she likes fictional in her work by mere stipulation, textual stipulation. I don't want to think about cases where J.K. Rowling, 50 years from now, when she's still alive, says, oh, by the way, Harry Potter was actually Adolf Hitler and he came back, and right? There's these worries about how you get to change the canon, okay? I'm just talking about what is written in the text of a particular novel or a particular short story. So that's poetic license. What's wrong with it? Okay. What's wrong with it is it seems to come up, as I said at the beginning, against counterexamples. And I will call these counterexamples puzzle cases. These are the cases that give rise to the puzzle of imaginative resistance. So take the following case, which I would call Giselda. Okay. Suppose you're reading a novel and you come across the following line. In killing her baby, Giselda did the right thing. After all, it was a girl. Okay. Now, that deserves a sip of tea. Heady stuff. Okay. I take it there are two things that probably occurred when you read that line and imagined encountering it in a work of fiction. One is that you had trouble imagining it. What would it be to have done the right thing in virtue of by killing a baby in virtue of that baby's being a girl? Well, how do I kind of visualize that or make that real in the imaginative project of engaging with work of fiction? The other thing, which I think is related, is that you will probably think that it's not true in the story, or as I put it earlier, it's not fictional that Giselda did the right thing. That's what the author thinks, sure. Okay? Maybe you even have an experience of what a philosopher called Tamar Gendler calls pop-out, right? Where what might have been a faint or absent narrator becomes an unreliable narrator. Where you say, I don't actually think that's right. That's certainly not true in the world, that Giselda did the right thing. This case contradicts, on the face of it, poetic license. I'm going to take it as a counterexample. Okay. Now, there's a certain worry here. This case is taken from an article by a philosopher called Kendall Walton, who is quite influential in this literature. And one might worry that these are, as it were, philosophers' fictions. These are kind of philosophers' toy cases, and do we ever really encounter anything like this in actual existing literature? That might be a worry you have about it standing as a counterexample. So my first response to that is to say, look, I'm not sure how much that really matters, because you and I could go away now and write a story and put this line in the story, and then we would have the puzzling phenomenon, right? But the other thing is, and I noticed this only very recently, is there are cases that I think are borderline puzzle cases. So in the Grimm's fairy tales, there is a not very well-known story called The White Snake, and it's about some young lad, and he goes and performs a bunch of good turns, and then he reaps his reward at the end, something like that. But anyway, there's a part of one of the good turns he performs is as follows. Okay, I've edited the text slightly, but this is roughly it. The path led the lad into a wood, and here he saw two poor young ravens laying upon the ground, flapping their wings and crying, "Oh, what helpless chicks we are! We must shift for ourselves, and yet we cannot fly. What can we do but lie here and starve?" So the good young fellow alighted and killed his horse with his sword, and gave it to them for food. Then they came hopping up to it, satisfied their hunger, and cried, "We will remember you! One good turn deserves another." Now, I take it that, to report my own experience reading this particular passage, I did not accept it as fictional that this person was a good lad, and certainly not a good lad in virtue of murdering his horse to feed two strange ravens that he just encountered on the path. Right? But we could embellish the case a bit to make it closer to a case like Giselda, right? Be even more forceful as a counterexample. Okay. Oh, that's my daughter. She crops up everywhere. So in a way there's kind of two puzzles here, okay? One is about what we can imagine, and the other one is about what an author can make fictional. And I'm kind of conflating them a bit, right? I'm kind of smushing them together. That's okay for me because I think they're closely related, but just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to talk as though there's one puzzle here most of the time. Okay. That's my daughter again. So that's the puzzle. What are the solutions? And what do I mean by solution? Well, we started with this interesting claim that seems, on the face of it, obviously true, that authors can make whatever they want fictional in their stories, any proposition they like fictional in their stories. And then we've come across these counterexamples. And now the question is, what is it about these counterexamples that makes them counterexamples? Why is it that an author's power to make propositions fictional is curtailed at the point of these counterexamples? That's what I mean by a solution. So the first solution, or the first set of solutions in the literature, they're quite sophisticated, but the first set of the solutions has a basic kernel in common, and that is what explains our inability to imagine the puzzle cases and to accept them as fictional is something about our desires. Right? That is to say that we don't want to imagine them, and so we resist imagining them. And just to add a bit more complication, in particular, we don't want to imagine them because of what that would say about ourselves, about what we would be implicated in by accepting that the story was true. Right? So think of the Giselda case again. The idea is that if I go along with a story, or the reason I don't go along with the story, is at least partly explained by the fact that in doing so I would implicate myself in a certain misogynistic worldview, a worldview where it's acceptable to kill babies in virtue of there being girls. Right? To motivate the idea, think about a very common practice in this country and in other countries of naming kindergarten classes, right? So you go to a kindergarten and you might have a class with the rainbows, the unicorns, the pebbles, the koalas, right? That's a naming practice that we actually have. But we could have had a different naming practice, right? We could have called the classes the vultures, the cockroaches, the maggots. Come on, little Timmy, off you go to the verrucas, right? The tumors. But we don't have that naming practice, except I think Jim told me that he's a proud alumnus of the tumour class. Alrewas might be the exception. Anyway, so we have this phenomenon of naming kindergarten classes, and it abides by the first practice, not the second one. And then there's a question about why is that? And I think part of the explanation is that we don't want to imagine our children as verrucas or toads or vultures, right? We would much rather imagine them as rainbows or unicorns. So something like that is going on here. That's the idea. If we were to name our kindergarten classes like that, that would implicate us in a certain perverse way of imagining our children. That's the idea. Okay. So that's the solution. Does it work? Well, it butts up against, I think, a reasonably obvious problem, which is that we imagine deeply unpleasant things all the time, right? And even ones that might implicate us in a certain kind of worldview that we find perverse. So suppose, and this is where my daughter features now, sadly for her. Here's my daughter. Her name is Katerina. Suppose you were to draw a caricature of my daughter as a cockroach, okay? Then the first thing to say is, "Don't you dare, you monster!" And then the second thing to say is, that it would be very odd of me, looking at that caricature, to say that A, I couldn't imagine her as a cockroach, right? And B, that it wasn't fictional, it wasn't true in the fiction that the picture generates, that in some sense my daughter is a cockroach. Right? That just doesn't seem to be a kind of explanation that's open to me. Compare that to the Giselda case, for instance. I think there it's much easier to motivate a claim that we literally can't imagine the claim, and it's not a matter of us refusing to accept that the proposition is fictional, it's that we can't accept it as fiction, right? What would it even mean for someone to have done the right thing in virtue of committing that act? Okay. I'm going to take that solution and it's kind of done away with. A second solution, so that's the desire solution, a second solution might appeal to something that's common to the white snake case and the Giselda case. You'll notice that both involve moral claims. Right? So maybe there's something about making moral claims, in particular morally false claims, that engenders imaginative resistance, that creates these puzzle cases. This actually has a precedent in the writings of David Hume in the 18th century, in his essay on the standard of taste, which in a way is where current literature draws its inspiration from in thinking about this phenomenon. He says the following, talking about works of poetry and prose fiction. Where speculative errors may be found in the polite writings of any age or country, they detract but little from the value of those compositions. There needs to be but a certain turn of thought or imagination to make us enter into all the opinions which then prevailed and relish the sentiments or conclusions derived from them. But a very violent effort is requisite to change our judgment of manners and excite sentiments of approbation or blame. Here he's talking, to put it very roughly, about the moral sentiments. Love or hatred, different from those to which the mind from long custom has been familiarized. And this is the crucial bit. I cannot, hence I put it in bold, nor is it proper that I should enter into such vicious sentiments. So he's thinking here some classical works of fiction from Greece, or you might think of the Icelandic sagas, where the value system that seems to be at play is kind of all over the place by our standards. And Hume's point is that he just, as it were, can't go along with those stories because they make these morally perverse claims, or they attempt to make it fictional that certain morally perverse claims are true in the story. Oops. I got ahead of myself there. Okay. There's a kind of obvious way to motivate the idea that immoral claims might be what explain puzzle cases as well, which is that many philosophers have thought that moral claims are categorical. That is, if it's true, say, at our world, that genocide is wrong, then it's true at our world, however it might have been. Or as philosophers might put it, it's true at any possible world. Right? It's not some contingent fact about, it's not like, genocide is wrong here, but if Jim had combed his hair differently, then it'd be okay. Or if there were more countries, it would be okay. Right? It's wrong wherever, however the world might have been. Right? And if that's true, then it would make sense why we might struggle to accept it being right in the actual world, true in the actual world, but false at some other possible world created in the work of fiction. Compare that to non-moral cases, right? So it's true at the actual world that I'm giving a talk in Alrewas, but there is a possible world, which is a way of saying it might have been the case that I wasn't giving a talk in Alrewas because my car had broken down, or maybe you guys all went and had coffee instead because you thought it would be a better use of your time. So I didn't hold the talk. So on one hand you have these non-moral claims, they could be different in different worlds, as it were, and moral claims which, if they're true at one world, they're true at all worlds. If they're false at one world, they're false at all worlds. And that will explain why we struggle to accept them and imagine them. Okay. So much for motivating the solution. What's the problem? Well, not all puzzle cases, it appears, are cases that involve moral propositions. That is, propositions that are morally true or morally false. Take the following case, which is from the philosopher Stephen Yarblow. I've called it Oval. Okay. They flocked down beneath the great maple, one more item to find, and yet the game seemed lost. Hang on, Sally said, it's staring us in the face. This is a maple tree we're under. She grabbed a 5-fingered leaf. Here was the oval they needed. They ran off to claim their prize. Right. I take it that this story, absurd though it is, attempts to make it fictional that these people have found an oval in virtue of finding something that's shaped roughly like this, okay? But that we can't accept that it's true in the story. We can't accept that it's fictional, that they've done that. Right? Why is the oval case interesting? Well, it's clearly not about morality. Right? So whatever phenomenon is occurring with the previous cases, the previous puzzle cases we looked at, seems to also be exemplifiable by these other cases that don't involve moral propositions. Okay. The third and final stab at a solution. Okay. Maybe there was something about the categorical nature of the claim, right? Maybe it was not the morality per se, but maybe there was something about a claim being true at all possible worlds that could be explanatory here. Okay. What would it be for a claim to be true at all possible worlds? It would be a necessarily true claim. Okay. What would a claim that was false at all possible worlds be? Well, it would be a necessarily false claim, or, as we might put it, an impossible claim. A claim, a proposition that is impossible, is a proposition that is true at no possible world. Right? So maybe what's explanatory here is impossibility. Let's think about the cases. It's impossible for Giselda to have done the right thing precisely in virtue of babies being a girl by killing that baby. Right? It's impossible for someone to be a good lad in virtue of murdering their horse to feed 2 strange ravens. And it's impossible for something shaped like this to be an oval. Right? Something that has a maple leaf shape to be an oval. So maybe that's the solution. So what's the problem? Well, there are all sorts of what we might call impossible fictions, that is, fictions that make impossible propositions fictional, make them true in the story. This is the photo, of course, from Back to the Future, in which Marty McFly is a 33-year-old, spoiler alert, okay? And this film, for those who still haven't seen it, you should go see it. You don't even have to travel back in time, you can watch old films. Marty McFly travels back in time by accident and interrupts the moment at which his parents meet, right? Or not meet, but the kind of pivotal moment in their romantic relationship, I guess. Worse still, he invites the romantic interest of his mother-to-be, right? And so the whole film is him trying to deflect this romantic, it's like reverse Oedipal interest, and try to reunite her with the person who will go on to be his dad, right? Now, let's see I've queued up a scene so we can just get into the spirit of the film so you can see what I'm talking about.
Play with his hand like that, and we can't play without him.
Yeah, well, look, Marvin, you gotta play. See, that's why they kiss for the first time on the dance floor, and if there's no music, they can't dance. If they can't dance, they can't kiss. If they can't kiss, they can't fall in love, and I'm history.
Hey man, the dance is over. Unless you know somebody else that can play the guitar. This is for all you lovers out there.
Earth angel, will you be mine? My darling dear, love you.
George, aren't you gonna kiss me?
I don't know.
I'm just a fool.
Scram, McFly.
there are some weird things about this film. Okay? Now, you'll notice that Marty and his siblings were disappearing from this photograph because if his parents, their courtship doesn't work out, then he ceases to be, because it's essential to anyone's being that they have the parents they in fact have, right? But what's really, really weird is that someone still took the identical photo of the well in the future. Also, there's a point where he's there, but his siblings have gone. So somehow the courtship was enough to keep him in existence, but his siblings have disappeared. So there's all sorts of weird inconsistencies here. But anyway, the biggest one, of course, is that I take it it's impossible for someone to interrupt the courtship of their own parents, right? For the reasons stated, namely that it's essential to your own existence that your parents' courtship not be interrupted. Maybe you don't like that case, maybe like, that one seems fine. I take that that's definitely impossible, but we have no trouble imagining it, we have no trouble accepting the various propositions that the film makes fictional as being fictional. Here's another case that you might like, returning to literature. It's the case of Watson, Dr. Watson's war wound. Okay? So in the Sherlock Holmes sort of stories, obviously there was a series of stories. There's a weird thing that happens with Watson's war wound, okay? As we shall see. So in the earlier of the three stories that I will talk about, we are told this by Watson, who is the narrator. He says, "I was struck on the shoulder by a Giselle bullet, which shattered the bone and grazed the subclavian artery." Okay. So Watson has a Giselle bullet, an old bullet in his shoulder. Then in the sign of the fall, he says, "I sat nursing my wounded leg. I had had a Giselle bullet through it some time before, and though it did not prevent me from walking, it ate wearily at every change of the weather." Right? Okay, so, I mean, unlucky guy, he's had not only two bullets, but two Giselle bullets in his body, and they're still lodged there. One's in his shoulder, one's in his leg. But here's where it gets really weird. In The Adventure of the Noble Bachelor, he says, "The Giselle bullet, which I brought back in one of my limbs as a relic of my hand campaign, throbbed with dull persistence." Brought back in one of my limbs. I mean, now you might say, well, a shoulder isn't technically a limb or something, but it's clear that what's gone on here is that Arthur Conan Doyle has just flubbed the text, right? So what is fictional in the Sherlock Holmes series? This is going to sound absolutely mental, but I think actually on final-ish analysis, the most plausible thing to say is that there are inconsistent propositions that are fictional, that is true in the story, but their conjunction isn't true in the story. So normally in the actual world, the way logic works is that if P is true and Q is true, then the conjunction P and Q is true. Right? The conjunction just follows from the two conjuncts. But in fiction, sometimes you have really weird things where P can be true and not P can be true. Or in this case, if P can be true, if P is he has it in his shoulder, Q can be true if Q is he has it in his leg. But the conjunction P and Q is not true in the story. Right? Because it's not the case that he has two war wounds, as we discover in The Noble Bachelor. Alright, that's kind of weird. It's not a straight up contradiction, so maybe you don't like that one either. But I take it, I must be warming you up to the idea now, at least, that things that we take to be impossible in actuality are possible in works of fiction. That is, fictional worlds don't work like possible worlds. You can think of it that way. Here's one final non-literary case. M. C. Escher's Ascending and Descending. This is one where I don't think you can perform the non-conjunction trick. Okay? Here I think it's the case that the people going clockwise around the stairs are both ascending and not ascending. It is the case that they're ascending and it's not the case that they're ascending. And both of those are true. And to understand the picture, I think you have to be able to entertain that conjunction, you have to entertain that contradiction. That's why it's such a spectacular idea and spectacular image. Okay, if that's true, then that's premature. Well, I am grateful. The possibility solution doesn't work either. Okay? And so where does that leave us? Well, none of the solutions we've canvassed, or that I've canvassed today, work. What have we learned? Well, one thing we've learned is that imaginative resistance is a bit of a misnomer, because as we've seen, the puzzle doesn't necessarily involve the imagination. It can also involve fictionality, which is technically distinct from the imagination. And it's not necessarily a case of resistance, this puzzling phenomenon we're talking about, because while the desire theory, the first solution we looked at, would have it that we resist imagining these puzzling propositions, it seems just as plausible, perhaps more plausible, than actually we are just incapable of imagining. Something else we've learned is that 3, superficially at least, promising kinds of solutions don't seem to work. And philosophy, like a lot of academic disciplines, is, to put it cornily, it's about the journey, man. Okay? It's not so much, or not always, or solely the case that we're interested in getting the final analysis. We're also interested in cutting off the dead ends, right? Exploring the dead ends and realizing that they are dead ends, so that we can understand the problem better. And I think we've done that today. We've looked at 3 plausible solutions and seen their, I claim, shortcuts. In the time we have left, I invite you to make your own suggestions, if you'd like to, about how to think about this puzzle. And also invite you, if you have any questions about philosophy or aesthetics or fiction in general, to raise those too. And with that...
Yeah, shall I join you now? Yeah.
Nils, I've got a question.
I'm afraid you have to direct it to the...
Oh.
Any questions?
Yes, mother.
Does the chair recognise me?
I recognise
So why are we...
Possibility solution.
So, why are we, as being so interested in fiction, in terms of creating all of those situations where we're making things up that aren't real? Why is it necessary to us? Is that a question?
That is a question, and it's a good question, a very interesting one. In a way, it's a question not for a philosopher or not for this philosopher, but maybe for an anthropologist or a psychologist.
Right.
There's a very general question why it is we're interested in fiction. I think on the best understanding of fiction, what works of fiction do is continuous with what children's and adults' games of make-believe do. That is, say a novel or a sculpture or a painting, they function as props in games in something like the way that a toy car or a doll or a hobby horse functions as a prop. And so we can rephrase the question and say, well, why are we interested in make-believe or in the kind of imaginative activity that's required for make-believe? And I suspect it probably has a very kind of prosaic explanation, which is something like that in order to communicate in memorable ways to one another certain things we've discovered, maybe about our environment, about dangers that lurk, about opportunities, we have to be able to engage the imagination. That is to say, I think it's probably a kind of byproduct of certain evolutionary pressures. So that's a very kind of scientific answer to your question. The more humanistic answer is just, it's a lot of fun, it's rewarding, clearly, and exploring certain kinds of intellectual boundaries is just something that, if we didn't have that, then it would just be trips to the supermarket and parking tickets.
It's massively powerful, of course, isn't it? For some reason, the War of the Worlds, radio broadcast popped into my head. I don't know why, when you were talking.
Yeah.
About the fact that the whole, believability of things and the moral issue. When a lot of America who listened to it were, thought it was real.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like the boundary between what they were prepared to believe and what they
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of liminal case because I take it though it was a work of fiction, lots of the appreciators didn't realise it was a work of fiction, right? Hence the apparent mass panic. It's also important to keep two things apart. One is about the claims that a work tries to make, more specifically moral claims that a work tries to make true in a story, which a work might try to do in order to propagandize in a certain way. So that's one kind of sphere of morality. And then there's another moral question about the morality of the artwork itself, not the fictional content of the work, but was it produced by slaves? Did it horrendously mislead hundreds of people? Does engaging in it cause certain kinds of pathological behaviour? Those kinds of questions. And I think it's important to keep those distinct, but it's all part of the moral melange that surrounds our work. Thanks.
You talked about the inconsistencies within the text, as it were.
Yeah.
Presumably there's also something about the person reading it, or the viewer looking at a piece of art or whatever, and about their prior knowledge.
Yes.
So if they have prior knowledge of an instance where a baby was killed because of that, then they say, well, yeah, I know something like that, or whatever, I can accept that. But something else wouldn't. So there's some of the other things, I know people forget where they have wounds or something strange.
Yeah.
I can understand, I can believe that it might come up more than once.
Yes. I think in the case where someone says, I know someone who killed their baby because it was a girl, so it's okay, they're just mistaken. But there's the deeper point that you're making here is that what we take to be imaginable, that is morally imaginable, will depend on the particular moral orientation of the particular reader. So I just glossed over that issue for the sake of simplicity here. There's this thing that philosophers do, which is kind of annoying to non-philosophers, is that we idealize the discussion in a certain way. Because, if a Nazi reads a text or someone from the 13th century reads a text, there's going to be things that they'll be able to imagine as being morally true in the story, which kind of right-thinking people like us in Alrewas are going to say, no, there's no plausible case to be made for that being true in the story. So what we often do in philosophy is we idealize, we assume a certain realistic picture of morality, that is that there are facts about which moral claims are true and which claims are false. There might be some grey area cases as well. And then we assume that the appreciator we're talking about, who is or isn't able to imagine particular propositions, that person is a kind of ideally equipped appreciator, right? They don't have weird foibles, like they don't understand how certain kinds of science that's relevant to the story works. They're someone who is like completely informed with respect to the story, so that they're not resisting for strange reasons. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it just seems a bit odd that in a way that is assigning views to the person who's reading it or whatever, when in their terms they might be able to think they're a perfectly normal person. They're not a sort of strange person as you're suggesting. They would think that they're normal, and all the people around them think that they're normal, because that's the way of thinking you say in the 13th century.
So of course one can think one is a normal person and be incorrect. That's a possibility. Another thing you can do here is right. If you don't like, you might just be insane or something. Not you specifically. Maybe this guy. Another thing you can do if you don't like that kind of the moral realism that I'm assuming for the sake of discussion is that you can have a kind of relativized version of this puzzle. You can say, look, for any particular reader, take the moral commitments. Isn't it interesting that ordinarily they would grant the author carte blanche with respect to what is fiction and story the author is creating, but aren't there going to be cases, Giselda or Giselda Star or some other case, where a claim is made that contradicts a particular moral commitment of that specific reader? And won't that be a case where that reader will struggle to imagine the claim and to accept that it's fictional? That is, you can make you can run the puzzle but relativize it to different readers, right? And essentially it's the same puzzle, it just has a slightly different inflection. Thanks.
Hi. Hi, and through the chair, Jim.
Thanks for that, Nils. I really enjoyed it. I was just hanging in after lunch. And I think I'm still hanging in there. Just briefly following on really from the previous discussion and question, something about the moral issue, the moral state and the desire.
Yeah.
I can see movement and flexibility depending on context and time and all that. The third one of impossibility and what's true, for want of a better word. I was sort of struck while you were talking about how memory is so flaky. You know, a whole bunch of people see something or experience something, and that's true for them. So the boundaries are very movable for me. You know, what is real and what is true, and is your experience. You know, we both look out that window and we see different things. So I began to feel that the impossibility one is also really flaky.
Right.
And I was sort of wondering if you were sort of suggesting that there is something that's actually true.
Yes, I definitely think that is the case.
Says who? So, you know, is it again contextual, for example?
Yeah, we have to keep apart two separate things, right? One is about what is the case, and the second is about what we can establish to be the case. Now, it might be that we're so cognitively dysfunctional as a society, and I think the last 3 or 4 years politically might bear this out, that we find it very difficult to settle on what is true. Now, normally people raise this kind of issue about aesthetic judgments or moral judgments, and normally the move I will pull to say, hey, disagreement doesn't equal no fact of the matter, is to say, look, take a historical work. Historians disagree about all sorts of things, but I take it that there were facts of the matter about what happened, at least at certain levels of specification. But if your question is about claims like just regular empirical claims, is it the case that it's true that I'm wearing 2 shoes right now, for instance, then we'd have to have a slightly more complicated discussion than maybe this forum would allow. But if you were, sorry,
because of time falsification, when is it not true? You know, like Popper was saying, let's look at when what we think is true is not true. There's something about that.
Yeah, I mean, Popper there is concerned about, he's replacing kind of system of induction that goes back to people like Bacon, or he's trying to replace it with a new heuristic, a new method for investigating scientific claims. Yeah. So in a way there, he's really talking about scientific method as a way of establishing what is true. Yeah. I'm not a Popper scholar, but I don't believe Popper, in fact, I think Popper presupposes that there are true and false claims. Popper's a bit weird because he comes from a time and a place where the logical positivists and so forth were knocking about, and so they had some pretty wacky views about truth and what could be established. Namely, that there was some very tight connection between what we can verify and what is true. But I think there's an important distinction between what I can establish and what is the case, and also what I can establish to someone else's satisfaction and what is the case. But you're right, if it turns out that there are no truths or something, then in a way this all goes out the window. But also, none of the theories is true or false because there are no truths. So, hey, it's a kind of Pyrrhic victory, but I'll take your theory.
Thanks.
John. Thank you for an interesting question. And I'm trying to figure out, for me, what the puzzle actually is.
Okay.
So maybe I'm just lacking imaginative resistance in all of this, but it seems to me that when an author comes along and they categorize their work as fiction, stroke fictional, I find I suspend lots of judgments about whether or not they're operating within a certain moral sphere, or indeed a scientific sphere. Take, for example, a cartoon. So if you have, Wile E. Coyote shooting off the cliff, and then, he doesn't actually succumb to gravity, or maybe floats off, or he explodes, but he's there in the next scene. I don't think to myself, oh, well, that's clearly not true, because to me, it's within an accepted realm in which you suspend disbelief. You don't necessarily ask the moral questions about things. That doesn't mean morality doesn't matter, that it doesn't exist. But in the world that particular author has created, they invite us to join in perhaps some of their suppositions, which is why I was just struggling a little bit with the premise, I suppose, of the entire lecture, because I was wondering, is it really a puzzle? Are you trying to say we really shouldn't have fiction because we might mistake it for reality at times? Because to me, if you have, the Da Vinci Code, a lot of Christians got terribly upset about the contents of Dan Brown's, first kind of major work, almost because they were reading it as though it was nonfiction. And when I read it, I thought, what the hell's the problem here? Seriously, this is a work of fiction. And he might have used aspects of historical reality, but he branded it as a fictional work, so I wasn't coming away feeling conflicted by it.
Yes.
Whereas if he said, I mark this as a work of history, then I might have come across saying, I have a different set of questions. Do you want to respond to any of that?
I'm sorry. There's a lot there. Just quickly on the Dan Brown thing, it's an interesting case because if I recall rightly, the book purports to be an instance of the genre historical fiction, I think, right? Yeah. That is to say, the main protagonists or whatever are obviously imaginatively created, but the places and historical events it talks about are supposed to be more or less veridical, right? So there's interesting questions there about what exactly people are getting angry about. Some people might get angry just because some people are easily offended, and it deals with some pretty tender topics. Other people might be getting angry for, as it were, more legitimate reasons having to do with the responsibility of authors working in certain genres not to mislead the people they're writing for. But yeah, I agree. In spite of all that, ordinarily you can imagine long. It's not a problem. Is it not really a puzzle? You're not alone in thinking that, so that's the good news for you.
Because I'm struggling with it. It seems interesting, but I just don't see it as being a real puzzle.
Yeah. There's something you said about should we not create fiction because we might mistake it for truth. That wasn't supposed to be the force of my interest in the puzzle or other people's. It's rather that there seems to be, perhaps only superficially, if we're wrong, that there are certain restrictions on what we're able to imagine, regardless of what we ought or ought not to imagine. Right? So it's a descriptive claim rather than a normative claim. It's not about what we should or shouldn't do, it's about what we can do or can't do. But you might still be skeptical about that. You might say, I have no problem imagining that Griselda did the right thing in the context of a story. One way someone might set up the puzzle with thinking about the moral cases is, you can have science fiction, but you can't have morality fiction. Right? There are certain things that you can't in the moral sense, you can't in the, as philosophers would put it, the elethic sense. It's impossible to bend certain rules of fictional end. If you're skeptical about that, then I have certain sympathies. In my own published solution to this puzzle, there's a way of reading it that chimes with your skepticism. That is to say, I think actually what's going on here, but we definitely didn't have time to go into it, was, even though it's an awesome theory and correct, because it's mine, is that there is what I call a normative constraint, that is a constraint on what we are permitted to imagine, given, very roughly given the genre that the work falls into. That is to say, I actually think you can have morality fiction, and maybe the only way to get cases like the Griselda case going is imagining that sentence appearing in a very naturalistic, matter-of-fact novel. There's two things that can happen when you come across that Griselda sentence. One is you go, I thought this was a work of realist fiction, but now I realise it's some experimental morality fiction. The other response you can have is to go, no, all the evidence says it's realist fiction, and that claim just isn't true in the story, it's not fiction. Right? If that second interpretation is available, then there's still a puzzle, but you'll have a much smaller puzzle for the kinds of skeptical reasons that you've raised, I think.
Thank you.
Sorry, it was very long-winded. Thanks.
But if you go back to pages
Hang on, sorry.
Sorry.
Just 'cause Dor-
That's all right.
Yeah?
No, carry on if you've got the direct.
No, I'm just going to say, why don't the constraints apply to the imagination of the author? Because you start off with a proposition that is imagined.
Yes, that's an excellent question. This comes back to, sorry, I don't know your name, Peter. This comes back to Peter's question. Presumably the author, it's not clear what the author's intentions are, right? To say if the author were a profound misogynist in writing Griselda, then it would be possible for them to imagine a morally false view. It's not moral falsehood that makes the claim unimaginable. It would be moral falsehood relative to a certain set of moral commitments that would make it unimaginable. And in that case, then, you and I would struggle to imagine it because we aren't of that view, but the author wouldn't. But there might still be a claim about, given that we accept that that moral view is incorrect, right? Suppose we accept that. I certainly think it's incorrect. We can still ask questions about what is fictional in the story, on the best interpretation, say, even though the author might have incorrect beliefs about what is fictional in the story, because they have this particular morally perverse view. We've been circling around this a little bit with some of the questions, which is kind of, well, who has the authority to say which moral view is true or false? I'm taking it as given that we could all be wrong about what is morally true and false, but that there is a fact of the matter about what is morally true or false. And if you deny that claim, you run into some pretty devastating questions, right? Which is that you have to say things like, well, I guess the Holocaust was neither okay nor not okay. It wasn't not okay, and that you might think, well, that's quite a commitment to take on. Right? That's a bit of a cheap shot, but that's a way of motivating the idea that it's not cost-free to say morality is in the eye of the beholder, or there just isn't a fact of the matter of what's morally true or false.
Can I bring Dario and then I think Tom and Bert?
Yeah, thank you for a great talk. I'm interested in this blurring of fiction and non-fiction, and particularly what is accepted. And you had the example of the film Back to the Future, and I hadn't actually thought about it in that way, that of course it couldn't happen and why I accepted in the story. But applying that in a more practical sense to politics, I'm interested in if you could comment on how politicians blend fact and lies and then present it in a story format, and why some people accept what they present and others do not accept it.
Wow. I think the simple answer is, it's very complicated, and I think we all appreciate that it's complicated why it is we embrace certain mythologies in political discourse. The simple answer, I suppose, is that in most cases, the people who are receptive to the lies don't read them as lies. Or even if they detect some insincerity about the speaker, they still take the content to be true. I can lie to you insofar as I say something that I think is false, right, that turns out to be true, right?
Can I just make a comment about the brain is very, very primitive, and some of the things that you said about Griselda and killing a baby is deep within the consciousness of man sometimes, very deeply buried, and it brings it up. And the moral story is that we don't accept that, and that is the valve. But deep down, there's this underground river of unacceptable behaviour of a very ancient part of our brain. And maybe this is what some philosophers are looking at and exploring. And the unconscious and the subconscious and the conscious brain are trying to make sense of it all. Yeah? Because what we consciously think about such things, and what we, in our dreams and in our imaginations when we're going to sleep, are totally different. And this is what I think this was exploring a little bit. You know? And we all have these, well, no, that's the wrong thing to say. Some people have the strangest thoughts, either when they're going to sleep or when they're dreaming.
Yeah.
And this is the underlying strata of being human. And this is what you're exploring maybe, and trying to knit them together.
That might be right. It might be right that the idea behind this part of the story, like Giselda, speaks to some.
And stories are, aren't they?
Yeah, stories certainly express profound commitment. And
I think of Bruegel's paintings as well.
Right.
Of hell, you know, and the estuary, that you can't make sense of it. It's
Yes.
all exploring the two different, or whatever levels there are.
That might be right, yeah.
Trying to make sense of something you can't make sense of.
That might be right. It's worth pointing out that this phenomenon, I think, would occur even if we were all psychically cleansed and didn't have some turbulent subconscious activity going on. There might still be limits to what we could imagine. Yeah, thanks. Going back to the political discourse, yeah, I think that given people's explicit beliefs, but also their kind of subcognitive commitments, which is maybe what made you think about that, they are just more receptive to certain kinds of messaging, and then other people who don't share those beliefs. So if someone has a deep-seated hatred of a group of people, say, that will make them more receptive to certain kinds of dog whistle, political discourse, for instance. But that's, I don't think I've told you anything terribly deep or that you probably didn't already know. But maybe I didn't understand precisely what the nature of the question
I
was.
think we need stories, and we need imagination to stay sane.
That certainly seems true.
Should we take one more from that? And
Yeah, I think I was going to ask something that touches on the same thing. Really. You mentioned earlier about anthropologists and psychologists.
Yeah.
Because for me, I think that's where we are. Then you mentioned Francis Bacon.
Yeah.
One of his things is, well, what is it? What is truth? Asked Pilate. I would not wait for an answer.
Right.
You know, and I think that is really deeply human. I was struck by Paula's question about the War of the Worlds, where you've got this mass belief in that this thing was true. And I think it's quite important to accept that they wanted it to be true. There was a part of them that wanted that story to be true, which is a bit frightening, really, but I think that must be the case.
Are you talking with respect to the kinds of puzzle cases we're talking about? Or? Yeah, I think that has relevance to the political question as well. That there's a kind of enlightenment hangover about how belief works, which is that beliefs track the truth, and that they do so at the exclusion of other kinds of motivations and attitudes. But I think anyone who's spent 5 minutes with a social psychologist knows that actually it's much more complicated than that, and at least part of the story is the kinds of desires or evaluative judgments that person makes them more receptive, even if it shouldn't in some sense. Makes them more receptive to certain kinds of political claims, for instance. If you want something to be true, that often goes a long way to making the case that you believe it to be true.
we're out of time, guys. Sorry, John. Just one, yeah. Sure.
I was just going to say, thank you very much for the talk. Very
No problem,
interesting.
thank you.
I noticed in the news recently there's a tremendous female-male imbalance in a large part of China due to the suppression of the birth of women. Giselda, in real terms, not fiction.
Yeah. So, I mean, the very short answer to give is that sounds right, and that's one of the reasons why the policy is so awful. And that's all grist to my mill, right? Because I want that claim to come out as one that we find so awful that we can't even conceive of what it would be for that claim to be true. Yeah. I should say though that of course there might be contexts in which that sentence, the proposition expressed by Giselda, might be true, where, for instance, there are overwhelming costs to not committing the act. Right. Here's a fanciful example. An evil alien comes down and says, you have to kill your baby girl, otherwise they destroy the whole earth. Well, that might be a case where you did the right thing in killing the baby because it was a girl, right? So, but that's an easy way out, right? You can say, I can imagine Giselda, provided you have this really exotic context, right? But what's actually interesting about the claim is why can't authors make these propositions fictional in their stories, absent weird exotic context? Yeah. So it's choice.
Nice, that was great. We're out of time. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you, Nils.
We're hay.
Are they real fun?